My name is Renata Holloway. I'm 27 years old, and the moment I need to tell you about first, the one that started all of this, happened at my own college graduation, in a room full of people who were there to celebrate their kids, while my father stood 3 feet away from me and explained to our neighbor why I had never really applied myself. He did not whisper it. He did not pull the man aside. He stood in the atrium of the Coliseum with a plastic cup of punch in his hand, in his good Navy suit, and he said it the way he said everything, measured, even. Like a man who had rehearsed the sentence until it sounded like an observation instead of a verdict. Renata always had potential, but she never really applied herself to anything practical. And then, almost like an afterthought, there are 100,000 accountants. I was wearing my cap and gown. My tassel was still on the wrong side because I hadn't moved it yet. I'd been so careful about that, I'd looked it up the night before. You move it from right to left after you receive your diploma. And I had done it exactly right and then stood there in the atrium and forgotten to feel proud of it. I looked at him. He didn't look back. He was already nodding at something David Whitfield was saying about David Whitfield's son, Derek, who had also graduated that day. My mother was standing 2 feet to his left. She was looking at a spot somewhere past his shoulder. Not at me, just past. That was the moment. That's where this whole thing begins. Before I go any further, if you found this video, I want you to stay. Because what comes after that moment in the atrium is the part that changed everything, and I don't want you to miss it. If you're not subscribed yet, please do that right now. Hit the like button while you're there. And if someone in your life has ever made you feel like your achievements were theirs to minimize, share this with them. Because I think they need to hear where this story goes. Drop in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love knowing who's on the other side of this. Now let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in Beckley, West Virginia, in a house that looked exactly right from the outside. 2 stories, half an acre. My father left for work in a pressed shirt every single morning. My mother brought casseroles to sick neighbors. We went to church. We had a good car. If you drove past our house, you would have assumed a certain kind of life was happening inside it. And you would have been half correct. The other half was what you don't see from the street. My brother Colt is 4 years older than me. Growing up, he was the easy one. Athletic, agreeable, the kind of kid who made my father look good at youth football games. I was the one who asked questions. I was the one who, at 11 years old, found a stack of past due notices in the kitchen drawer while looking for a pen, brought them to my mother with genuine confusion, and watched her smile tighten into something I didn't have a word for yet. She took them from my hands and said, "That's not something little girls need to worry about." That night, I heard my parents arguing through their bedroom door. My father's voice was low and controlled. My mother's was apologetic. I understood something that night that I didn't have language for until I was much older. There were 2 realities in that house, the one we showed the street and the one that lived in the drawers. And the rule, unspoken, absolute, was that you did not confuse the 2. I spent the rest of my childhood paying attention to everything. What I noticed, Colt's baseball fees were never a problem. My school trip permission slips sat on the kitchen counter for 2 weeks while money was figured out. Colt got a car at 17. I was told I could use theirs, with permission, in advance, with a reason. Colt's decisions were called good instincts. Mine were called impractical. When I said I wanted to study accounting, my father made the same face he made when the cable went out. A brief, private irritation that he smoothed over quickly because showing it would have been impolite. I don't tell you this to make him a villain. I tell you this because I need you to understand who I was by the time I walked onto that campus. A girl who had been taught in 100 small and specific ways that the rules of reality that applied to her were slightly harder than the ones that applied to the people around her. And I had internalized it enough that I almost believed it. Almost. I got into West Virginia University on an academic merit scholarship. My parents did not co-sign a single loan. When I told my father this, that I had figured it out, that the scholarship plus federal loans plus a part-time job would cover it, he nodded and said, "See, when you apply yourself." As if this was evidence of something he had always known rather than something I had done entirely without him. I worked 20 hours a week at the university library for all 4 years. I filed my own FAFSA at 18, alone at the desk in my dorm room with a YouTube tutorial playing on my phone, because I did not know what I was doing and there was no one to ask. I ate a lot of dining hall pasta in year 2 when I miscalculated my summer budget and came up short. I learned to read a balance sheet the same semester I learned to read my own bank account carefully enough that I never overdrafted again. By junior year, my GPA was a 3.89. My financial statement analysis professor, Dr. Creighton, told me in office hours that I had the sharpest instinct for discrepancy he'd seen in 12 years of teaching, that I could find the thing that didn't add up faster than students who had been studying this material for twice as long. I sat in his office chair and nodded and said thank you, and then walked to the bathroom down the hall and stood at the sink for about 90 seconds, because something about being seen that clearly after so long made it hard to breathe for a moment. My mother called that same week to ask if I was eating enough, and whether I had remembered to send a birthday card to my great-aunt in Roanoke. We spoke for 11 minutes. I did not mention the professor. I had learned by then what to carry in which direction. The person who showed up was Becca Stanton, my roommate from freshman year, who was still my roommate in junior year because we had figured out early that this was just a fact about our lives now. Becca grew up in Columbus in a loud, functional family of 5, and she related to emotional honesty the way some people relate to breathing. It just seemed obvious to her that you did it. She had watched me handle my parents' phone calls for 3 years. She had a specific way of sitting with me after those calls, not asking, not offering, just being completely present in the room, which was more than I had ever asked for and more than I had known to want. The night I came back from Dr. Creighton's office and didn't know what to do with the feeling, she looked at me from across the room, put down her book, and said, "Something good happened." Not a question. I said yes. She said, "Tell me." And I did, and the whole time I was talking, she just nodded slowly, like everything I was saying was exactly what she already knew was true about me. The family's reaction to Becca, the one time she came to Beckley for a weekend in our senior year, told me everything I needed to confirm. My father was polite in the way he was polite to anyone he couldn't categorize. My mother kept asking her questions about her family, her parents' jobs, her hometown, with a particular brightness that I recognized as the sound of someone calculating social coordinates. Becca answered everything warmly and without any awareness of being measured. On the drive home, she said, "Your dad smiles with his mouth and thinks with his eyes at the same time. Is that a thing he always does?" I said yes. I'd just never heard it described like that before. And then came graduation day. Magna cum laude. 4 years. Every loan form filled out alone. A professor who told me I had the sharpest instinct he'd seen in 12 years. And my father, in the atrium, in his navy suit, explaining to David Whitfield why I'd never really applied myself. If you have ever stood in a room where you were supposed to be celebrated and felt instead like you had just been quietly erased, if you know what it is to have your achievement reframed into an inconvenience by someone who should have been your loudest fan, then you already know exactly what I felt standing there with my tassel on the wrong side and my diploma rolled up in my hands. And if this is already hitting somewhere real for you, I want you to hit that like button right now, subscribe if you haven't yet, and please share this with someone who needs to hear that the story doesn't end in that atrium. Because what comes next, what I found out, what came apart, and what I had to decide to do, that's what this is actually about. Let me keep going. Becca drove me home. Not to my parents' hotel, not to the post-ceremony dinner my mother had made a reservation for, at the Italian place on Fayetteville Street that my father had chosen because it had valet parking, and he liked places with valet parking. She drove me to my apartment, and neither of us discussed whether that was the right call, because it obviously was, and we both knew it. We sat in her car in the parking lot for 41 minutes. I know it was 41 because I watched the clock on her dashboard the way you watch something small and neutral when the rest of the room is too much to look at directly. She didn't tell me what to feel. She didn't say he was wrong, though he was, and she didn't say I should call him, and she didn't say it didn't matter. She just sat there with the engine off and let me talk. I described what happened the way I would describe a transaction. Subject, action, result. My father had said this. David Whitfield had been standing there. My mother had looked at the middle distance. I had left. I gave her the facts in the order they occurred, and by the time I finished, Becca was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He specifically waited until someone was listening. Why?" I didn't have an answer. I told her I didn't know, but the question lodged somewhere behind my sternum and stayed there, the way questions do when they're not actually questions, when they're the beginning of something you're not ready to name yet. I went inside. I took off the cap and gown and hung them on the back of my closet door because I didn't know what else to do with them. I made tea I didn't drink. I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. Not because I had a plan, but because sitting with my hands still has never been something I could do for very long when something doesn't add up. I want to be clear about what I did and what I didn't do. I did not open any system I was not authorized to access. I did not use any tools from my firm. I was a junior forensic accountant with a brand new CPA license and a thorough understanding of exactly where the ethical lines were, and I stayed on my side of every single one of them. What I did was pull public records, Secretary of State filings, annual reports, the kind of documents that exist specifically because they are supposed to be visible to anyone who wants to look. I was looking for the thing that didn't add up. I have been looking for that thing my entire life. I just didn't know, until that night, that it was going to be this. The first 2 hours gave me anomalies. Revenue figures in 3 consecutive filings that were inconsistent with the number of employees listed. A pattern I recognized. Not from instinct, but from a continuing education module I had completed 6 months earlier on premium diversion schemes, which is when an insurance broker collects premiums from clients and then doesn't actually forward them to the underwriting carrier. The money goes somewhere else instead. The policies appear to exist, until something happens and someone tries to make a claim, and then suddenly, they don't. I closed the laptop. I made more tea. I stood at my kitchen window in the dark and looked at the parking lot lights for a long time. I want you to understand what it feels like to suspect something like this about your own father. It is not a clean feeling. It is not the feeling of a puzzle clicking into place. It is closer to the feeling of standing on a floor you have always assumed was solid and noticing, for the first time, that it moves slightly when you shift your weight. You don't want to be right. You are not hoping to be right. Every part of you is looking for the alternative explanation, the innocent version, the story where the numbers are just sloppy record-keeping and nothing more. I looked for that story for about 3 hours. I could not find it. The next morning, I called the West Virginia offices of the insurance commissioner. I want to be precise about this. I called to ask a procedural question about licensing verification. I was not reporting anything. I was a person with a professional background in financial investigation asking a bureaucratic question, the same way anyone might call a government office to understand a process. The woman who answered was helpful and matter-of-fact, and at the end of our conversation, without my asking, she mentioned that the commissioner's office had received several complaints in the past 8 months about a small Raleigh County brokerage. Complaints regarding premiums that had been paid in, but for which no corresponding policies could be verified in any state database. I said, "Can you tell me the name of the brokerage?" I already knew. Have you ever had a moment where you learned something that you already knew? Where confirmation arrives and instead of surprise you feel this terrible, settling quiet, like the last piece of a picture sliding into place and the picture is one you were hoping you had misread. That is what that moment felt like. I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and the morning light coming through the window, and I felt the floor stop moving, because now I knew exactly what the floor was made of. That afternoon, I called my supervisor at Callaway and Marsh. I disclosed the personal connection immediately. I asked to be formally recused from any professional involvement in anything related to Holloway Regional Insurance Group, now or in the future. I asked her to document the conversation. She was quiet for a moment and then said, carefully, "Renata, are you okay?" And I said, "I need this on record first, then I'll answer that." She put it on record. Then I told her I didn't know yet. I need you to understand why that call mattered so much to me. Because I knew what was coming, not the specifics, not the timeline, but the shape of it. And I knew that when it came, the first thing someone would look for is whether I had done anything improper. Whether I had used my position, or my access, or my training to go after my own father. And the answer had to be no. The answer had to be documented, verifiable, airtight. Not because I was protecting myself from consequences, but because the truth only counts if your hands are completely clean when you're holding it. I had learned that from the same profession my father had spent a year telling me was impractical. And right here, right at this moment, where you can see exactly what it means to have someone use your own career, your own intelligence, your own sense of right and wrong as the weapon they're most afraid of, I want to ask you something directly. Drop it in the comments. Have you ever had someone try to make you feel small about the very thing that ended up protecting you? Because I think about that a lot. I think about the fact that my father spent years dismissing what I do for a living, And what I do for a living is the exact reason my hands were clean when everything came apart. Leave it in the comments. I read every single one of them. Colt called me that same evening. Gerald had already gotten to him. My father had framed the graduation situation as Renata acting out, being emotional, being dramatic, making a scene out of nothing because she had always taken things too personally. Colt delivered this the way he delivered everything our father told him, with the absolute sincerity of a person who has never once considered that the information he's receiving might have been selected for him. "Ren, you know how he is," he said. "You've always taken it too personally." I listened to that for a moment. Then I said, "Colt, what do you actually do at the brokerage?" A pause. "Sales support. I've told you that." "What does that mean specifically?" Another pause, longer. "Why are you asking me that?" I let it go. I didn't push. I said something neutral and ended the call shortly after, and then I sat with what that pause meant for a while. Colt was not malicious. He was not lying to me. He genuinely didn't know what he did at the brokerage in any specific, articulable way, because the job had never required him to know. He was there to be Gerald Holloway's son in that office, which was its own function, and he had been compensated for it his whole life without ever being asked to look at it clearly. That, in its own way, was the saddest part of what I was beginning to understand. 3 weeks after graduation, on a Sunday evening, my mother called. Diane Holloway calls on Sunday evenings the way certain people go to church, out of structure rather than feeling, because the routine of it is the comfort, not the content. We talked for several minutes about her garden, a neighbor's new car, something happening at church. And then, right at the end, in the particular tone she used for things she was saying without saying them, she said, "Your father works very hard to keep this family together, Renata. I hope you understand what that means." I held the phone and looked at my kitchen wall. The plaster had a small crack near the corner of the window that I had been meaning to report to my landlord for 2 months. I focused on that crack. "I know he works hard, Mom," I said. She waited a beat, like she was hoping for something more. I didn't give it. We said goodbye warmly, the way we always did, warmly and with almost nothing real between us. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and opened a blank document. I titled it 2 columns, "What I owe them, What they owe me." I sat there for a long time with my hands on the keyboard, and then I closed it without typing a single word and deleted it without saving. Some accounting you do in your head and then let go. Some debts you decide, quietly and permanently, not to collect on. That was the last normal week before everything changed. The fraud investigation that eventually produced charges against my father was not something I started. I want to say that again because I need you to hear it. I did not report him. What I did was document my own recusal, protect my own integrity, and then step back. What happened next happened because of a 71-year-old retired school teacher named Carolyn Fuchs from Sophia, West Virginia, who had paid 36 months of premiums on a homeowner's policy and discovered, after a kitchen fire, that her policy did not exist in any insurance database in the state of West Virginia. Carolyn Fuchs filed a complaint with the commissioner's office and retained an attorney. Her attorney subpoenaed business records. The records produced 11 additional clients in identical situations, 11 families who had been paying for protection they did not have. 11 families who had trusted a man in a pressed shirt who smiled in the right way and told them their homes and their businesses and their futures were covered. I learned about the charges from a news notification on my phone on a Tuesday morning while I was eating breakfast. A bowl of cereal. Ordinary cereal, the kind I had been buying for 3 years because it was on sale most weeks. I set my spoon down on the table. I sat very still for a moment, looking at the screen. Then I picked up my phone and called Becca. "It happened," I said. "Are you okay?" she said. I thought about it. Not the performance of thinking about it, actually sitting with the question honestly. "I didn't do it," I said finally. "I need you to know that first. I didn't report him." "I know," she said. "That's not what I asked. Are you okay?" And that right there, is the question that took me the rest of the story to answer. I didn't go to work that day. That is not something I do. I have a nearly perfect attendance record at Callaway and Marsh, not because I am performing diligence, but because the work genuinely centers me. The clean logic of numbers, the satisfaction of a reconciliation that resolves correctly, the particular quiet of my desk in the morning before anyone else arrives. I find the work steadying in a way I have never fully explained to anyone. So when I called in and said I needed a personal day, my supervisor simply said, "Take what you need," and didn't ask for more, which told me she already knew, because of course she did. She had taken my recusal call weeks earlier, and she was a smart woman who read news notifications the same as everyone else. I stayed in my apartment. I made coffee and then didn't drink it. I sat on my couch with my phone face down on the cushion beside me and tried to locate what I was actually feeling, the way you try to find the source of a sound in a quiet building. Turning slowly, waiting for it to get louder. It wasn't relief. I want to be honest about that because I think some people hear a story like this and assume the moment of exposure would feel like exhaling after holding your breath for a long time. It didn't. It felt closer to the moment after a car accident when you realize you're not hurt, but you're still sitting in the middle of the road, and the car is still running, and you have to figure out what to do next. Functional shock. Clarity without comfort. What I felt mostly was tired. And underneath the tired, something I didn't have a clean name for yet. Not grief exactly, not anger. Something that had been there for a long time, pressed flat under the weight of everything I had spent years not saying, beginning very slowly to take up space. My phone lit up with Colt's name 3 times before noon. I let it go to voicemail all 3 times. I was not ready for Colt. Colt was going to need something from me. Some version of events, some framework, some reassurance, and I did not have anything left over to give him. Not yet. I made myself eat lunch. I stood at the kitchen counter and ate half a sandwich and looked out the window at the parking lot and thought about Carolyn Fuchs. 71 years old, retired school teacher, kitchen fire. 36 months of premiums, every single one of them paid on time. I would bet anything on that. The kind of woman who paid things on time, who kept records, who did everything right, who came home after a fire to discover that the protection she had paid for did not exist, had never existed, had been a document and a handshake and a man in a pressed shirt telling her she was covered. I thought about her standing in whatever was left of her kitchen. I thought about 11 families. I finished the sandwich. I put the plate in the sink. And then I did the thing I always do when the world gets too large to hold all at once. I opened my laptop and I made a list. Not of the fraud, not of the charges, not of anything related to my father's case. A list of what I knew for certain. What I had done. What I had not done. What was in my control. What wasn't. I made the columns neat and I filled them in carefully. And when I was finished, I looked at it for a while. And it told me what it always tells me. That the situation was serious, that I was not responsible for causing it, and that the only thing left to decide was what kind of person I was going to be while it unfolded. I had made that decision before. I just had to find it again under everything else. The 4th time Colt called, I picked up. He was not angry. That was the first thing I noticed. I had braced for anger, for Gerald's framing delivered at Colt's volume, the accusation dressed up as a question. Instead, he was something I had never heard from him before, something that was almost worse than anger because I didn't know how to hold it. He was frightened. Genuinely, completely, structurally frightened. The way a person is frightened when the thing they built their entire sense of reality on has just been publicly named as a lie. "Did you know?" he asked. Not accusatory, just needing something solid to stand on. "I suspected," I said. "I didn't report it. Someone else did. I need you to hear that clearly." A long silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" I took a breath. "What would you have done, Colt?" He didn't answer. I let that question stay in the space between us without filling it, because it was the most important question he had ever been asked, and it deserved the room to be uncomfortable. Not as a punishment, as a gift, even if it didn't feel like one. The call I was not prepared for came 12 days after the charges were filed, on a Wednesday evening, while I was sitting at my desk working on an audit reconciliation that had been giving me trouble for 2 days. My buzzer went off. I wasn't expecting anyone. I pressed the intercom and said hello, and after a moment my mother's voice came through the speaker. "It's me," she said. "Can I come up?" I stood at the intercom for probably 5 full seconds. Then I buzzed her in. She looked smaller than she had at graduation. Not physically. She was the same height, same posture, the erect bearing of a woman who was raised to present herself properly in all circumstances. But something in the way she stood in my doorway was different. She was in jeans and a cardigan. Her hair wasn't fully done. She was not wearing the pearl earrings. These are small details, I know. But if you knew my mother, you would understand that showing up at someone's door without the pearl earrings meant something had changed in the architecture of how she was presenting herself to the world. "He told me not to come here," she said. "I came anyway." I stepped back and let her in. We sat at my kitchen table. I made tea and we both held our mugs and didn't drink. She talked for a long time. Not the managed version, not the Sunday evening phone call version, not the casserole to the neighbors version. The actual version. She talked about the past due notices that had been coming for years. About the specific way Gerald spoke to her when she asked questions. Not loudly, never loudly, but with a quiet precision that made her feel like the question itself was the problem, rather than whatever the question was about. She talked about the night she had decided, consciously and deliberately, to stop asking. She cried twice. Quietly, in the way of someone for whom crying is not a regular practice. And here, right here, watching my mother sit at my kitchen table and be a human being for what felt like the first time in my memory. If this is hitting you the way it hit me, I need you to hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't. Because what she said next is the thing I have carried with me every single day since, and I don't want you to miss the rest of this. She looked at her mug and she said, "I should have protected you better. I don't know what I should have done differently. I don't know if it would have changed anything." I looked at her for a moment. My mother, 54 years old in my kitchen, finally putting something true on the table between us. "It would have changed some things," I said, quietly, simply. Not as an attack, just as a fact that deserved to exist in the room. She nodded. She left an hour later. I stood at the window and watched her walk to her car in the parking lot, and I noticed that she walked more slowly than I remembered. Or maybe I had just never watched her walk away before without feeling the need to call something after her. It was not a repair. I want to be clear about that. It was not the beginning of a fixed relationship or a healed one or a transformed one. It was something smaller than that and more honest than most things that had ever happened between us. It was my mother telling me the truth in a room, which she had never done, which was not nothing. Gerald's case proceeded through the following weeks, with the particular grinding momentum of legal processes. Slowly, inevitably, without drama. His attorney negotiated. The commissioner's office was not interested in mercy. 11 families had paid for protection they never received, and the documentation the subpoena had produced was, by all accounts, thorough. He entered a plea agreement. No prison time, but substantial fines, civil liability to every defrauded client, and the permanent revocation of his insurance license. Holloway Regional Insurance Group was dissolved. The house in Beckley, the 2-story colonial on the half-acre lot, the one that had always looked exactly right from the outside, was listed. I learned most of this from Becca, who had a friend whose husband worked at the county courthouse, and who understood that I needed to know what was happening without having to be the person who sought it out. She would text me in the measured, specific way she did everything. Not, "Have you heard?" but, "Here is what I know, here is what I don't know, here is what seems to be next." She was a container for information I couldn't hold myself, and she held it without making me feel fragile for needing her to. Colt's awakening happened slowly and without fanfare, the way most real reckonings do. He called me twice more in the weeks after the plea. The conversations were shorter than they used to be, but denser. More silence, more actual words in the silence. He had started asking questions at the brokerage before it was dissolved, and what he found when he finally looked was not complicated or hidden well. It was just there. The way things are when someone has stopped being careful because they stopped believing anyone would look. He said to me on one of those calls, "I worked there for 3 years. I had no idea." I said, "I know." "How did you—" He stopped, started again. "How did you always know to look?" I thought about an 11-year-old girl finding notices in a kitchen drawer. About a professor who said she had the sharpest instinct for discrepancy he had seen in 12 years. About the specific cost of growing up in a house with 2 realities and learning, out of survival, to tell them apart. "I had good teachers," I said. And I meant it in every direction it could possibly go. The thing about consequences is that they do not require your participation. I did not attend any hearings. I did not speak to the press. I did not post anything on any platform. I did not call David Whitfield, who would have been very interested to know how practical accounting had turned out to be. I did none of those things because none of them were mine to do. What I did, every single day during that period, was go to work. I sat at my desk, I opened the files, I found the things that didn't add up and I documented them carefully, and I handed them to the people who needed them. I did my job. I did it well. And in the doing of it, in the clean, ordinary repetition of it, I found something I hadn't expected to find in the middle of all of this. I found out that I was not waiting for the outcome to feel okay. I already was. The morning I decided to write the letter, I woke up before my alarm again. It was early, the particular early that belongs to the hour before the city remembers itself, when the parking lot outside my window is empty except for the overnight cars, and the light is the color of something not quite decided yet. I lay there for a moment with my eyes open and the ceiling above me and the quiet around me, and I thought about what Becca had said on the phone the night before, when I had told her what I was thinking about doing. She had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want it to do?" Not what do you want to say. What do you want it to do? I had thought about that for the rest of the evening, and I had thought about it in the thin space between sleeping and waking, and when I opened my eyes in the pre-dawn quiet of my apartment, I knew the answer. I didn't want it to wound anyone. I didn't want it to win anything. I didn't want it to be the final word in an argument that had been running for 27 years. I wanted it to be the moment I stopped writing that argument in my own body, stopped carrying it in my shoulders and my jaw and the careful way I had learned to manage my face when certain subjects came up. I wanted to set it down. Not for them, for me. I got up. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a legal pad beside it because I always think better when I can move between the two, and I started writing. The letter was not long. That surprised me. I had expected it to be long, had expected years of compressed weight to require a lot of pages to carry. But the thing about finally knowing exactly what you mean is that you don't need many words to mean it. I wrote 3 paragraphs. I read them back. I changed 4 words. I read them again. The first paragraph said, "I understand now why my achievements made you uncomfortable. I understand that a daughter who was trained to find what doesn't add up was the last thing you needed in the family. I am not saying this to be cruel. I am saying it because I spent a long time believing your discomfort was about me, about something I was doing wrong, something I was failing to be. And I needed to say clearly, to you and to myself, that it wasn't." The second paragraph said, "I am not asking for an apology. I am not asking for anything. I am telling you that I am removing myself from the role I have been playing in this family. The role of the problem, the difficult one, the one who asks too many questions. I am not playing it anymore. Not out of anger, out of accuracy." The third paragraph said, "I hope the people Carolyn Fuchs hired find every dollar. I hope every one of those 11 families is made whole. And I hope you find a way to live with what you chose." I genuinely mean that. I am not being sarcastic. Choosing how to live with what we've done is the only real work any of us ever does, and I am doing my own version of it, and I wish you whatever clarity it takes to do yours. I printed it. I put it in an envelope. I did not write a return address on the back. I called Becca and read it to her over the phone, sitting cross-legged on my couch with the envelope on the cushion beside me. She listened all the way through without interrupting, which was how I knew she understood what it was. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That's exactly who you are." Not, "That's so good," or "That's brave," or "Are you sure?" Just, "That's exactly who you are." 4 words that landed somewhere in the center of my chest and stayed. I mailed it that afternoon on my way to work, dropped it in the blue collection box on the corner of Courier and Capitol, the one I passed every single morning, and then kept walking without looking back. Not dramatically, just kept walking. Because the thing was done and I had somewhere to be. I want to tell you something about what happened in the weeks after the plea agreement, in the town my parents had spent 30 years building a reputation inside. Beckley is not a large place. It is the kind of town where the same families have been sitting in the same church pews for 3 generations, where people know your car by sight and your business by inference, and where the distance between a rumor and a fact is mostly a matter of how many days have passed. My father had cultivated his standing there with the same precision he brought to everything that was visible: the good suit, the handshake, the community board membership, the check written to the right causes at the right times. All of that has a half-life. It turns out the half-life is roughly proportional to how many of your neighbors discover their homeowners' policies were fictitious. Becca's courthouse contact kept her informed. She kept me informed. I heard things in the measured, second-hand way that felt appropriate. Not sought out, just received. The Whitfields had apparently been clients. David Whitfield, who had stood in the atrium at my graduation listening to my father explain that I had never really applied myself. David Whitfield's business insurance policy had been among the 11. I did not feel satisfied by this. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something quieter and harder to name. A recognition that the performance my father had maintained, the one that required my diminishment to sustain its proportions, had been held up by the same people it was eventually going to fall on. The community board position was quietly not renewed. 2 families from the church found a different congregation. The Beckley Register ran a brief follow-up piece when the civil liability settlement amounts were made public, small, factual, on the second page of the local section. I did not read it. Becca summarized it in 2 sentences because I had asked her to tell me if the clients were going to be made whole, and the answer was mostly yes, with the caveat that mostly is the best outcome most fraud cases produce, and it was better than many. I held on to that. Mostly whole is not nothing. It is not everything either, and Carolyn Fuchs deserved everything, but it was what the process could give, and I was grateful the process had gotten there. Colt came to Charleston about 6 weeks after the plea. He called first, which was new, or rather, the way he called was new. He said, "Can I come see you? Not to talk about him, just, I want to see you." And something in the plainness of that, the absence of an agenda, made me say yes without thinking about it. He showed up on a Saturday morning in clothes that didn't fit the occasion in either direction. Not dressed up, not careless, just himself in the way he rarely was when our parents were part of the frame. He was quieter than I was used to. He sat at my kitchen table, which had apparently become the place where true things happened, and he held his coffee with both hands and looked at it for a moment before he spoke. He said, "I've been trying to figure out when I stopped asking questions. Like, what age I was when I just decided not to." I looked at him. 31 years old. Our father's jawline, our mother's eyes, wearing our father's old cufflinks on a Saturday in Charleston for no particular reason, except that the habit of wearing them had not yet become a question he'd examined. "I think it was gradual," I said. "I think you were rewarded for not asking, for long enough that it stopped feeling like a choice." He nodded slowly. "And you were, what, punished for asking?" "Managed," I said. "There's a difference. Punished implies they acknowledged the asking. Managed means they just kept redirecting until the asking felt like the problem." He was quiet for a long time after that. We drank our coffee. I showed him the crack in the plaster near the kitchen window that I had finally reported to my landlord, and that still had not been fixed, and he looked at it with the particular expression of a man who has spent his life around someone who maintains appearances, and is only now starting to notice which things get fixed and which ones don't. He didn't apologize. Not directly, not in words. What he did was stay for 4 hours. We ate lunch. We watched part of a game he cared about more than I did, but which I was genuinely fine watching. We talked about things that had nothing to do with any of this, and then, at the end, when he was putting on his jacket to leave, he stopped at the door and said, "I should have paid more attention to what was happening to you. When we were kids, I should have noticed." I looked at my brother in my doorway, 31 years old, learning for the first time that seeing clearly is something you have to choose. "You're noticing now," I said. He nodded. He left. I closed the door and stood in my hallway for a moment, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not vindication, not the clean satisfaction of being owed something and receiving it. Something messier and more real than that. The beginning of something that might, given enough time and enough Saturday mornings, and enough honest conversations at kitchen tables, become a different kind of relationship with my brother. Not the one we should have had, the one we could actually build from here. It was not nothing. In fact, quietly, it was a great deal. The night everything finally settled, not resolved, not repaired, but settled. I was at my desk at 11:43 in the evening, working on the manufacturing audit that had been nagging at me for 2 days. A reconciliation issue, a $47,000 entry mislabeled across 3 accounts in a way that was almost certainly a clerical error, but that I needed to document carefully regardless, because almost certainly is not the same as certainly, and my job is to know the difference. I found it. I flagged it in the system. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. And I thought about an 11-year-old girl standing in a kitchen with a stack of past due notices in her hands, trying to understand why the world inside the drawer looked so different from the world outside the house. I thought about what it had cost her to keep looking, what it had built in her over 27 years of looking, the precision, the patience, the absolute refusal to let a number lie to her. The thing my father had spent years calling impractical. The thing that had kept my hands clean when I needed them to be. The thing I had done sitting at dorm room desks and library tables and this exact desk at 11:43 at night, because it was true, and it was mine, and no one's verdict on it had ever changed what it actually was. I closed the laptop. I sat in the quiet of my apartment. I thought about my mother at my kitchen table, not wearing the pearl earrings, telling me the truth for the first time. I thought about Colt in my doorway, beginning, slowly, to see. I thought about Carolyn Fuchs, who I had never met, who had paid 36 months of premiums and come home to a burned kitchen and decided that the right thing to do was to make a phone call, which is all any of us can really do when we find out the floor is not what we thought it was. Just make the call, and trust that the process, imperfect and slow and mostly but not entirely, will do the rest. I picked up my phone and texted Becca, found the discrepancy, and I'm okay. She replied in 40 seconds. I know you are. You've always been. I put the phone face down on the table. I looked at my ceiling. The crack in the plaster near the kitchen window was still there. My landlord had sent someone who had looked at it and scheduled someone else to actually fix it, which is how these things go. I had stopped being bothered by it. It was just a crack. The walls were still standing. My name is Renata Holloway. I am 27 years old, and I know now, not as a performance, not as something I tell myself to get through the hard days, but as a fact as clean and verifiable as anything I have ever found in a ledger, that I was never a failure. I was the person in that family who refused to stop looking at what was actually in the drawer. That quality cost me things I am still learning to grieve. It also meant that when the floor finally gave way, I was standing on solid ground. I did not build that ground alone. I built it at library desks and in Dr. Creighton's office and in a parking lot with Becca at 11 o'clock at night with the engine off. I built it in every hour I chose precision over comfort, truth over performance, accuracy over the version of events that would have been easier to live inside. That is not a failure. That is the only kind of success that actually holds. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it before you answer. Has someone ever tried to make you doubt the exact thing that ended up being your greatest strength? The quality they called too much, or impractical, or difficult, that turned out to be the thing that kept you standing when everything else came down? Leave it in the comments. Tell me about it. I read every single one, and I mean that genuinely. Your stories are the reason I keep telling mine. If something in this stayed with you today, hit the like button before you close this out. Subscribe so you're here for the next one. I have more to tell, and I want you to be in the room when I do. And if you know someone who is right now being told that the thing they're best at doesn't matter, share this with them. Tell them Renata said the floor holds. It just has to be built out of something real. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.